Lectures on the Basics of Biblical Greek, Chapter 14. In Chapter 14, we learn the last of the pronouns, and we bring our study of nouns, adjectives, and related forms to a conclusion. But before we do the last of the pronouns, let's review the pronouns we know already. The first two pronoun sets we learned were the interrogative and indefinite pronouns. Tis, ti. The interrogative pronoun used to ask a question is tis, ti with an accent on the initial syllable. The indefinite pronoun is tis, ti without an accent on the initial syllable or with an accent on the second or final syllable, the ultima. These forms are enclitic, that is, they tend to throw their accents to the previous words. So the forms are identical, it's just a difference of accentuation. Tis, ti without an accent, someone, something. We learned the first and second person pronouns. Ego, first person singular. Su, second person singular. Hemes, first person plural. Himes, second person plural. And to keep those two similarly sounding words separate, we noted that the himes has an upsilon or u in it. And by playing on that letter, one remembers the form more easily. The third person pronoun is autos, aute, auta. Its form is 2-1-2. The exception are the nominative and accusative singular, which do not have case endings. Nonetheless, that helps us distinguish those forms from the accusative singular masculine. When autos or one of its inflected forms stands by itself, it's a personal pronoun. But it can also be an intensifier or the adjective same if a noun or an article are involved. There are two demonstrative pronouns, also 2-1-2 in form. Ekenos, the demonstrative that, can be the demonstrative pronoun or the demonstrative adjective. Utos is the demonstrative this. It can also be a pronoun or an adjective. The awkward piece about hutos is that in the nominative, masculine and feminine, singular and plural, its initial letter is a rough breathing mark, whereas otherwise the form begins with a tau. The main vowel of the first syllable also varies from the diphthong omicron upsilon to the diphthong alpha upsilon, depending on the vowel of the second syllable. Omicron, omicron upsilon, or omega lead to a diphthong in the first syllable of omicron upsilon. Eta or alpha iota lead to a diphthong of alpha upsilon. It's a bit tricky at first, but once one gets the basic pattern, the forms aren't too difficult to recognize. And then there's the reflexive pronoun, which only occurs in the genitive, dative, and accusative, heautu, heautes, heautu, which mirrors back the meaning of the antecedent. Of himself, of herself, of itself, in the genitive singular case. In today's lesson, we're going to learn the relative pronoun. We'll start by looking at how the relative pronoun works in English, then the forms of the relative pronoun in Greek, the characteristics of that relative pronoun, and some hints for translation. So first of all, the relative pronoun in English. Who, whom, that, and whose are relative pronouns in English. Take, for example, the sentence, Sally, who studies Greek, works hard. Who is the relative pronoun? The student, whom the teacher helped, did well. Whom is the relative pronoun? The book that fell broke its binding. That is a relative pronoun. The New Testament, whose words I am learning, tells me about Jesus. Whose is a relative pronoun. However, the word who in English can also function in a question. Who is this? When who is used that way, it's not the relative pronoun. The interrogative who needs to be distinguished from the relative pronoun. Whom shall I send is interrogative. The one whom I sent, that's relative. Quite often in English, the relative pronoun modifies another noun. It functions adjectivally. The student who, the book which. The who clause or the which clause tells you something about its antecedent, the noun student or the noun book. A relative clause is the relative pronoun and the clause it introduces. These clauses are generally dependent. The student did well. That's the main clause. Whom the teacher helped is the relative clause. It tells us something about the student, answering the question, which student? But in addition to these adjectival uses, a relative clause may function in English as a noun also. The key is to treat it as a unit. For example, whoever believes, that relative clause functions as the subject of the sentence, whoever believes will be saved. As a direct object, she heard for herself whom they were praising. Whom they were praising is the direct object of she heard. And a relative clause may be the object of a preposition. Faith is certain. That's your main clause. Faith by which we believe, the which is the object of the preposition by. It helps to form a relative clause. With that overview of the relative pronoun in English, we now turn to its forms in Greek. The relative pronoun in many ways looks like the article without the tau, with a couple of minor variations. In place of the tau, all forms of the relative pronoun have a rough breathing mark, and all forms are accented. That's a way to distinguish the relative pronoun from similar one-letter forms in the article or in other forms. So the relative pronoun inflects according to a 2-1-2 pattern that we know from previous examples. It does not have a nu in the nominative and accusative singular, but otherwise this pattern should be very familiar to you. You've written this sequence many times before, just with something on the front of it. Here, what's on the front is the rough breathing mark. So the forms are hos, he, ha, who, what. The second line, genitive, who, heis, who, of whom, of which. The third line, dative singular, ho, he, ho, to whom, to which. The accusative singular, hon, hain, ha, whom, and which, by translation. The nominative plural, hoi, hi, ha, who, which things. The genitive plural, hon, of whom, or perhaps whose. The dative plural, hois, heis, hois, to whom, to which things. The accusative plural, hus, has, ha, which could be translated whom, which things. Again, the exact translation is very much a product of the context, but this gives you an idea. Notice the forms in blue. They all have a rough breathing mark and an accent. That's how you can tell the relative pronouns from other similar forms. Ha and ha. The first ha is a definite article. The second ha is a relative pronoun. Hoy and hoy, same thing. First one is the definite article. Second one with the accent is the relative pronoun. Hi, hi, same thing. First one is the definite article. Second one is the relative pronoun. The fourth example is a little tricky because here we have hey, hey, and a. The vowel is the same in all of these forms. With just a rough breathing mark, it's the definite article. With a rough breathing mark and an accent, it's the relative pronoun. With a smooth breathing mark and an accent, it's the form or than. Make sure you can tell the difference. Let's now talk about the characteristics of the relative pronoun in Greek. We've mentioned some of these before, but let's be systematic about it. In terms of form, the relative pronoun is a 2-1-2, except in the nominative, accusative, neuter, singular, where there is no case ending. And in terms of form, relative pronouns always have a rough breathing mark and an accent. You can see those in the shortened chart that I have provided for you here. The second characteristic of a relative pronoun is that the pronoun agrees in gender and number with its antecedent. For example, in the following sentence, "And I make known to you, brothers, the gospel which I have proclaimed to you," plural. The ha is neuter singular because its antecedent is neuter singular. But the case of the relative pronoun is according to its use in the relative clause, usually. This well-known passage, "Behold, I am sending my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way." The antecedent of hos is angelon, which is masculine singular. Thus, hos is masculine singular. However, hos is in the nominative case because within its relative clause, it functions as the subject of who will prepare your way. So again, in terms of form, relative pronouns are 2-1-2s, always having a rough breathing mark and an accent. Relative pronouns agree with their antecedent in gender and number, but the case is according to use in the clause, usually. Later on, we'll learn about one exception called attraction. Now for some hints that will help you in your initial attempts to translate relative clauses. Number one, if the relative pronoun modifies a word, that is, it's functioning adjectively, telling you something about its antecedent, use who, which, or that in your translation. For example, in this clause, the gift which Moses prescribed, the pros etaxen mouses is a relative clause that tells you something adjectively about the gift which Moses prescribed. Secondly, if the relative clause is substituting for the subject of the sentence or for an object, such as indirect, direct, or object of a preposition, you might add he, she, it, or they to the who, or perhaps use a demonstrative, this or that. Take the following sentence. The main clause are the white letters, kai uk estin mu axios. That reads, and he is not worthy of me. Now in place of the he, from the he is, the he, she, or it, the relative clause, hos u lambane ton stauron autu kai akaluthe opissomu, that whole phrase functions as the subject. And it would be translated this way. And he who does not take his cross and follow after me, that's your subject, is not worthy of me. So it's really important to treat the relative clause as a unit and keep it together. This relative clause for who has, that relative clause functions as the subject of dothesetai auto. For who has, it will be given to him. And as you probably have noticed in all of these examples, a relative clause headed by a relative pronoun is always dependent. It never is a full sentence in and of itself. It may function adjectivally to talk about a noun, or it may function as one of the parts of the sentence, subject or object, but it's not a sentence in and of itself. So, for example, in this sentence, ha edokasmoi, which you gave to me, that's not a complete sentence. The which you gave to me tells the reader something about the noun remata. The words which you gave to me, I have given autois to them. So again, if a relative pronoun and its clause modifies a word, it's functioning adjectively and use who, which, or that. If it's substituting for the subject or an object, you might use he, she, it, or they, who, or demonstrative. Always remember to keep the relative clause together as a unit. When I was first learning to translate, I put brackets around it to make sure I was remembering what was a relative clause. And do remember that relative clauses are always independent. They're not the main clause all by itself. So, in this lesson, we've talked about how relative pronouns and their clauses function in English. We've looked at the forms of the relative pronoun, very much like the definite article, except they all have a rough breathing mark, no taus, and they all have an accent. We've talked about the characteristics of the relative pronoun, how it agrees with its antecedent in gender and number, but gets its case from how it's used in a relative clause, and we've looked at several hints for translation. And that concludes Chapter 14 on the relative pronoun and our lectures on noun and noun-related forms. We'll do a test, and then we'll start verbs.